All right, so I'm recording. So welcome to the virtual class and to my virtual office. Dimitris,
Hi, Claire.
can you tell me the proper Greek pronunciation of your surname?
It's not easy. It's Xygalatas.
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 Xygalatas. Okay, because I have been pronouncing it wrong for about 15 years.
It doesn't matter. People here call me Xygalatas. I go by it. I go with it. It's fine.
Well, welcome to our class virtually. And so we are covering some of your work on rituals and fascinating stuff. So I would just want to ask a couple of questions about your work, things that the students can't get from the reading. So the first question I have is, why do you find the topic of rituals fascinating? Like, how did you get involved with this and what brings you to it?
So as somebody who studies ritual, I actually wonder why somebody wouldn't find it fascinating. You know, ritual is one of those domains of human life that are deeply meaningful to people. But then if you look at it, at least at first glance, it seems completely pointless. In fact, our very definition, most of academic definitions of ritual have to do with the fact that it's non-instrumental. It's causally opaque, right? People perform these actions, and either they don't know why they're performing them. Even as an anthropologist, I've asked thousands of people why they're performing their rituals, and usually they're puzzled by the question. They look at me and they go, "What do you mean? Like, they're a ritual. That's what we do." And at the same time, they find them tremendously important for their personal and collective identity, and yet they don't always have a clear explanation about why they do them. That's why I find it very fascinating. And from a personal kind of perspective, as a kid, I would read National Geographic magazine. I would have to travel to the city center to get it once a month, and I would look at all these exotic ritual practices that were practiced by groups like the Yanomamo in the Amazon, or various groups in Africa and other exotic places. And for a very long time, it hadn't occurred to me that every society has these practices. Mm. So it was sometime in my teens that I just realized, seeing a Greek ritual that was very high intensity. It's a pilgrimage taking place on the island of Tinos once a year, where you have people crawling on their hands and knees up the hill to visit a sacred icon. And looking at this ritual as a teenager, I thought, wow, these exotic practices that I thought were a thing of the past, or only happened in faraway places, they're actually all over the place. And once you start seeing this, then you see it everywhere. I started seeing rituals in the domain of sports, in what we do in a courtroom, what we did in school,
right,
in colleges, and so on and so forth. So it permeates our lives, and yet we don't have a clear explanation for it. That's why I find it so fascinating.
And part of your goal, as it were, as a researcher, is to illuminate the question of why we perform these rituals. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your research, and in particular, a lot of the themes that come up in this course are the relationship between science and religion. And you talked a little bit about, you can ask people why they do these things, and they can shake their head and they don't know, or they can think someone else knows, etc. So how do you approach this question of why do people perform ritual, and what's the benefit of the kind of scientific approaches that you use?
There's a philosopher called Sean Gallagher, and he talks about front-loading phenomenology. So in plain English, that means that we should take what people say seriously, and we should start with that and turn it into a workable hypothesis. So it would be easy to look at rituals that happen around the world and say, okay, those things are silly, they're pointless, they're antiquated, they're obsolete. Anytime now, it's going to be a thing of the past, except that never happens, right? But there's a point in wondering, if so many millions, in fact billions of people find those rituals, the various rituals that they perform, so deeply meaningful, then there's something to this experience.
Right.
That's different than saying that a tarot card reader or or a voodoo ritual actually has effects on the physical world, in the sense that you stab a doll and somebody gets hurt. That's not the kind of causality that I examine. But if millions of people say that they find consolation or healing in this or that ritual, then I think it's at least a question that is worth exploring. And in my research, the question that drives it is, how do we turn these kinds of questions into actually scientifically testable hypotheses?
Okay.
What aspects of, let's say, health can we measure to see what the impact of those rituals is on the people who perform it in ways.
Mm. Mm. And so, what are the effects? You kind of opened yourself up to that question, but
Sure.
I mean, so what methods do you use? And can you give us an example from your...
Yes, so let me break this into two kinds of examples, because I think that the rituals serve two broad kinds of purposes. First of all, they serve purposes for the individual. The individuals who perform these rituals, we see that they have benefits in terms of reducing anxiety, as you know from your own research, coping with grief, and so on and so forth. We've known this for a very long time, anecdotally. So early anthropologists, people like Bronislaw Malinowski, have documented, or at least have argued at the time, that people perform rituals as a way of coping with anxiety. So in my research, I thought, okay, how can we possibly test this claim?
Right.
Turns out it's not actually that difficult to test. We have anxiety is something that can be measurable. At least it has manifestations that are measurable, things like heart rate or skin conductance and so on and so forth. Measuring ritual is a little bit more tricky, but in one of the studies that we did, we stressed people up in a lab, and we had physiological monitors on them, so we could see that they were actually stressed. And then we simply...
Cruel experiment, are you? Okay, go on, sorry.
Well, the things we do for science.
Right,
and
stressed him out in the lab.
Then we needed to find a way of measuring ritualization. So we looked at various theories that were out there. So we took some aspects that we consider to be core aspects of ritual, things like repetition and redundancy and rigidity of behaviors, and we used motion sensors. So what we see is that the more stressed people are, the more ritualized their behaviors become. So we can measure their hand movements, for example, and they'll become very repetitive. Or we see action patterns that are repeated in time as they do things like everyday things like cleaning, for example. And then we wanted to sort of go full circle to see whether these actions actually help people deal with anxiety. And to do this, we went to the field in a real life setting in Mauritius, where I do my fieldwork. And we measured the physiological responses of people who performed the rituals of their own culture. And there we see that performing those rituals, temple prayers in the context of a Hindu community in Mauritius, that performing these rituals does reduce anxiety.
All right, so let me just make sure that I'm clear. Classic scholars, Malinowski, anthropologists, classic anthropologists, and other kind of social scientists have long argued the case that ritual alleviates anxiety. Mm-hmm. And you went into the field and through physiological measurements and the kind of naturalistic practice of ritual in Mauritius, were able to actually empirically and scientifically demonstrate that ritual alleviates anxiety.
Yes.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. That's a really impactful finding.
So I think there's a big problem in academia in general, and that's where I think my contribution comes in. For a very long time, anthropologists have looked at rituals and they've said that they serve this or that function, but they have both been unwilling and unable to test some of these theories. They've been unwilling because anthropologists work in the field and they're primarily interested in getting a sense of the lived experience of participating in different rituals. And a lot of them even frown upon any kind of measurements. And I think that's wrong.
Okay. They think it's reductionistic, right?
They think it's reductionistic. And I think they're missing out on a lot of of what we can know about ritual. At the same time, in the past, of course, Mayanovsky couldn't use heart rate monitors because there weren't any at the time, right? There are these technologies that are become available to us only in recent years, especially in a form that is unobtrusive and people can wear during their most sacred moments without even remembering that they're on. The devices I'm using actually have some of them here.
Oh, cool. I wish you could wire some of my students up.
They can be as small as this. So this is something you just wear on your arm up here and measures your heart rate.
Yeah, I actually have a Peloton heart rate monitor. It goes across your chest, and it's really.
So these things just, when I started doing this just over a decade ago, these things were just becoming widely available, and of course at first they were very expensive, and now these are consumer devices. So as I mentioned, anthropologists have avoided quantifying things. At the same time, psychologists who were better at quantifying things and measuring things for a very long time didn't really care much about ritual. For basically the entire 20th century, psychologists would see ritual as something that is not worth studying, something that was either silly or mundane or was going to be obsolete any time now. And it's only in the recent couple of decades, in the last couple of decades, that they've seriously looked at ritual. So I think this is a golden age for studying ritual because of these convergent developments.
I remember reading a paper of yours. I can't remember where it was, but the start of it, you said one of your students in an exam said that when it comes to anthropologists and psychologists, these two really need to see a therapist.
Yes.
And that it kind of exemplifies exactly what you're saying. And I agree wholeheartedly. You said there was you were going to talk about why do people perform rituals? So the first is the individual, and it seems like one benefit is alleviates anxiety. So what's the second?
So the first one is the individual level. I think you really need to account for the individual level if you're talking about some evolutionary functions of ritual, because if ritual doesn't appeal to us in the first place, we're just not going to do it. Since it does appeal to us in the first place, because it helps us deal with all sorts of anxieties, only then is it able to have these higher order effects. And when we talk about collective rituals.
Okay.
And the main function that anthropologists have pointed out, again, for 100 years without being able to document it, is its contribution to social cohesion.
Okay.
And there are many mechanisms by which ritual does this. Mm-hmm. And in my research, I've been able to study some of them.
And have you been able to integrate, I mean, I know the answer to this question is yes, but I'm just going to play dumb. Have you been able to integrate, I'm a good anthropologist, have you been able to integrate some of these technologies, you talked about heart rate monitors, into this question?
I have, yes. So we've done a lot of studies of collective rituals. Me and my colleagues and my former students, both graduate and undergraduate. So in one of those studies, for example, we used heart rate monitors in the context of a collective firewalking ritual. And we found that we also mapped the social network of this entire group. And we found that people's heart rates would synchronize during the ritual. And they would also synchronize to the degree that in which they were connected socially. So the stronger the social bonds, ritual will just amplify those bonds. And this was a first step. Now, wanting to see whether this actually translates into any behavioral benefits for the community, which is really what it comes down to. I did, for example, a study in Mauritius where we used economic gains. We set up a donation that people didn't know it was set up by us, but it was a charity. And we found that when they take part in painful rituals, the higher the intensity, the more money they donate to their community. In other studies, we got proxies for endorphin release. So we see that taking part in rituals that involve high arousal and synchronous movement actually increases the production of endorphins in the body. And endorphins are known as bonding molecules. So they contribute to this social cohesion. So we try to tackle this at multiple levels.
Right. There seems to be that there's multiple mechanisms through which the effects of ritual exert their effects, and trying to keep the kind of natural framework. So you're not dividing people into groups. They're naturally related to people or naturally not related. And you're really getting in with the heart rate monitors and proxies for other biophysical markers like endorphins, and you're measuring it and you're charting it, and you're able to really look at the causal mechanisms, which is really what was missing in a lot of this incredibly rich, detailed, beautiful ethnographic lucid descriptions of ritual. So thank you so much for talking to us today. I think your research is fascinating. I'm a big fan. I wanted to talk about your book. So I have a copy here. So this is where you started, right? This was your PhD fieldwork.
This is the result of my doctoral dissertation, yes.
This is The Burning Saints, and we have a copy of this in the library, and it's on Amazon. And you're working on a new project, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about this book, what it's called, when it's going to be out? Because I'm sure some of the students are keen to get a copy of it.
So the book you just showed us, that's the result of my first ethnographic work. I spent 18 months in a Greek village where people perform fire walking rituals. And that resulted in my doctoral thesis, which eventually became a book. Since then, I've done fieldwork in other places. I've spent over 4 years living in the field, most of it on the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. And I've done all these studies that we just discussed.
Yeah.
So currently I'm working on a book that is just about to come out in 2021. It's called The Power of Ritual. And this book synthesizes all these results and tries to give a big picture of precisely what it is that makes ritual such an efficient mental and social technology that it is.
Well, for one, I'm excited about this book, and I will include a link to the book for the students whenever it comes out, as this course will be going for quite a while. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your cool work. I know that you're going to inspire a whole generation of students to take up those heart rate monitors and other measurements and try to look at the...
Thank you for your kind words. It's great to see you, Claire.
Thank you. Bye-bye.